The Gulf War, where Iraq under Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait, and pretty much the whole world united to kick the Baathists out of Kuwait, but just that, kick Saddam out of Kuwait. Yet he remained in power after the end of the war as the coalition chose not to go into Baghdad for various reasons. There were, however, several attempts to remove Saddam from inside Iraq, most notably being the Shia and Kurdish uprisings. However, this also didn't work out. During the war, President George H.W. Bush had called on the Iraqi military to overthrow Saddam Hussein. However, this message would be misinterpreted by many Iraqis, who believed that U.S. tanks would be rolling into Iraq to support them in the Iraqi uprisings. However, this didn't happen, and Saddam Hussein remained in power, and he would brutally suppress the Shia and Kurdish populations for rebelling after the war. But what if, in an alternate timeline, the coalition did go into Iraq to topple Saddam? First, some context. The main reason why Bush and the coalition chose not to invade Iraq was fears of Iran taking advantage of an extremely weak Iraq. You see, the administration believed that if the Iraqi government was overthrown by the coalition, then not only would the coalition be stuck having to rebuild a broken Iraq, which would have infighting, insurgencies, terrorism, and violent political conflict, but also the coalition would have to worry about Iranian intervention into Iraq and an escalation of violence in the country that the coalition would have to deal with. Changes to occur in this alternate timeline would be if intelligence on Iran accurately detailed and depicted how weak Iran is at this time, as in our timeline, reports overestimate Iran's capabilities. This was because Iran and Iraq had just fought a decade-long devastating war, and at the end, although Iraq was in crippling debt, it had one of the largest militaries in the world. However, Iran had a more internal destruction to rebuild and really couldn't wage much of any kind of conflict in a weakened Iraq. But of course, the Ayatollah's regime would still support rebels and do general trolling around. Anyway, the coalition invasion into Iraq sees an immediate fall of Saddam's regime, and the Ba'athist government falls with relative ease. The invasion force coordinates with anti-Saddam rebels, and little resistance exists, and the Iraqi population cheers as the country is liberated from an authoritarian dictator. However, now comes the issue of the occupation and rebuilding Iraq. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is that 1991 and 2003 are not the same. To start, Iraq did not see sectarianism between Shia and Sunni populations until the sanctions that occurred during Bill Clinton's presidency throughout the 90s. So that is barely an issue in this alternate post-invasion Iraq. Second, Iraq didn't have to endure Clinton's sanctions, therefore Saddam Hussein didn't have complete control over the entire political and governmental system, and people didn't have to survive off the black market, which will make a transitional government a lot easier to set up. Additionally, this is the H.W. Bush administration that knows what it's doing on foreign policy and in rebuilding a liberated country, unlike certain idiots who were put in charge of nation building in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. Anyway, the question now becomes who is installed to lead Iraq after Saddam. Well, I think that the coalition would install a temporary dictatorship in Iraq to maintain stability over the country, with a military strongman who was a hero in the Iran-Iraq War and turned on Saddam during the Gulf War, who would be willing to work with coalition forces. Now, there's a lot of viable candidates to choose from, however the result would be pretty much the same for the sake of stability, and I'm not really going to go into all the candidates here. Political violence is pretty inevitable, as of course Iran is still opportunistic in attempting to do shenanigans in the region, but a large coalition occupation force will be keeping the violence to a relative minimum as the country begins to rebuild under the temporary regime. The Iraqi army is also kept intact, and most government officials are going to keep doing their jobs to make sure the country doesn't fall further into chaos. Now, regarding the insurgency, it's likely that elements such as the Republican Guard and Fedayeen Saddam forces aren't going to be cooperating with coalition forces or the new government and will start an insurgency with higher-ranking members of Saddam's former regime. However, most ordinary Iraqis aren't going to really support them because they are still having their jobs and the Iraqi army is intact. Additionally, the Ba'athist government was extremely unpopular, so people wouldn't really be wanting it back. The Kurds in northern Iraq are going to be getting their semi-autonomous region and pretty much be chilling in this alternate timeline. Coalition aircraft will make sure that nobody tries to attack the Kurds again, especially given what had previously happened during the Al-Anfal campaign, where Saddam had brutally gassed the Kurds towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War for rebelling. Coalition peacekeeping operations will continue on as, like I said before, Iraq had pretty much been bombed back into the Stone Age and the coalition is rebuilding. However, unlike the 2003 occupation, there had not been about a decade of sanctions to destroy the country's economy and sectarianize the population. Additionally, the coalition is maintaining peace and stability in coordination with the existing Iraqi security forces, which haven't been built up from scratch. Regarding counterinsurgency, the coalition would follow a clear and hold strategy where areas are cleared out of insurgents and coalition troops will remain in the area to hold it. This is in stark contrast to the search and destroy method of going into an area and getting rid of the insurgents and then leaving only for the insurgents to return, which will be a lot more effective here. Coalition troops will begin a withdrawal in mid-1990s once the insurgency is mostly over and once the Iraqi security forces, as well as the Iraqi state, are stable and strong enough to operate without relying on coalition presence in the country to deter Iranian aggression, as well as Iranian proxies from generally messing around. Again, the coalition had a large occupation force remain in the country instead of a small, light military footprint, which in this timeline will have crushed the insurgency early on and not allowed violence to escalate over time. Iraq in the 90s will see a transitional period from a US-supported dictatorship to a democracy, which will put Iraq in a rather vulnerable state regarding Iran and extremist groups such as Hezbollah. However, I believe this transition would have occurred around 1993. Coalition forces would have left in 1995 to make sure the country is stable enough in this delicate period. Regardless, Iraq returns to producing oil on the international market to boost its economy. It's possible that in the 2000s Iraq becomes a flourishing democracy if everything went right for the country. Again, big if, and there's a lot that could happen and can go wrong in the transitional period. Assuming Iraq didn't witness a civil war or drawn-out insurgency, things are going to look pretty good for the country and will appear to be a beacon of democracy for the Middle East, but things are still going to be flawed and imperfect as corruption always exists, and there are always going to be a lot of problems in the early years of a democracy, as politicians suck and are very opportunistic. Impacts on the Middle East that are in the 90s will be that since there's no Saddam Hussein in the region, Saudi Arabia will also not be requesting more U.S. military presence in the region to remain in the country throughout the decade to deter any potential Ba'athist invasion. Syria and Iran would definitely want to take advantage of Iraq in this timeline in whatever way they can, but also if Iraq did end up a functional democracy, then there might be an earlier Arab Spring type protest or rebellion type of event in the region. Impacts on U.S. politics would have probably seen George H.W. Bush win re-election in 1992, as the U.S. is fighting in Iraq and running counterinsurgency operations during the election. Also, neoconservatives could have become a larger part of the Republican Party well into the 90s and 2000s, and would be pointing to this alternate Iraq as a prime example of why they think the United States should invade other countries and enact regime change. How this impacts the late 90s and into the 21st century is beyond my ability to even consider accurately predicting, as with the 1996 election. That is just one scenario, and it's hard to predict these things with so many unknown factors. What do you think would have happened had the coalition went all the way and overthrown Saddam Hussein at the end of the Gulf War? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.